This poor girl was writing in her notebook when a passing millionaire read what she had written, and in a fit of rage kicked her notebooks, enraged by what she had written. But what happened after that was what shocked her the most. Subscribe to the channel and comment something to support my work. The morning was particularly cold in Chicago, and Richard adjusted his cashmere scarf as he exited RPM Italian, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. The 47-year-old businessman had just closed another multi-million-dollar deal, something that had become routine in his life in recent years. His steps were firm and decisive on the sidewalk of Oak Street, reflecting the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control of everything. The cloudy sky seemed to mirror his austere mood as he walked toward the imported car parked a few feet away. It was then that something unusual caught his attention. On the cold ground of the sidewalk, an extremely thin girl was sitting, scribbling something with an almost inkless pen. Richard couldn't explain why his feet stopped. Normally, he wouldn't even notice the presence of beggars. They were part of the urban landscape that he had chosen to ignore a long time ago. But there was something different about that child. Perhaps it was the way she concentrated on her writing, as if the world around her didn't exist. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her pale and hollow face revealed days, maybe weeks, of hunger. Her dark hair was tangled, and the clothes, besides being dirty, were clearly inadequate for the cold. Still, she kept writing, her small, trembling hand moving over a crumpled piece of paper. Against his own instincts, Richard approached. He leaned slightly, trying to decipher the crooked, childish words she scribbled so diligently. When he finally managed to read, he felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. "I'm going to die today. I can't stand being hungry anymore." Richard's reaction was visceral and unprepared. Years of a life built on the premise that feelings were synonymous with weakness exploded in a moment of inexplicable fury. His foot moved almost of its own accord, violently kicking the girl's few belongings, scattering dirty papers across the sidewalk. The child looked up, startled. They were large, dark eyes, marked by a sadness that seemed too old for her age. Tears began to run down her thin face, but she made no sound, as if she were too used to cruelty to protest. "Stop writing nonsense," he said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. He turned to leave, determined to forget that moment of weakness, that disturbance in his perfectly controlled routine. But something stopped him from taking the next step. A memory, long buried under layers of success and money, erupted in his mind with the force of a tsunami. The smell of garbage, the constant feeling of hunger, the cold that penetrated to the bones on the endless nights of his own miserable childhood. Richard closed his eyes tightly, trying to banish the unwanted memories. When he opened them again, the girl was still there, silently picking up her scattered papers, some now stained by the dirty water from the sidewalk. "Where's your family?" The question came out of his mouth before he could stop it. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, as if it belonged to someone else. The girl looked up again, and this time Richard noticed a detail that had escaped him before. There was a kind of resignation in her gaze, as if she had already given up waiting for anything good from life. "I don't have one," she replied, her voice so low that he had to lean in to hear. There was a slight tremor in her words, but she continued. "Mom got very sick. After she left, Dad changed. He brought me here one day and said he'd be right back. It's been a long time." Richard felt something break inside him. It was as if every word of that child hit a specific part of his soul that he had spent years trying to numb. Success, money, power, everything he had built to protect himself suddenly seemed fragile in the face of those sad eyes. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice sounding strangely hoarse. "Abigail," she replied, hugging the crumpled papers she had managed to recover to her chest. The cold wind blew harder, making the girl shrink. Richard looked around, noticing for the first time the curious glances of passers-by. Some quickly looked away, others watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. It was as if the whole world was waiting to see what that man in the expensive suit would do with that street child. Richard adjusted his coat, a nervous habit he hadn't shown in a long time. His mind, accustomed to making quick and practical decisions in the business world, seemed frozen. For the first time in years, he didn't know exactly what to do. "Come with me," he finally said, extending his hand to Abigail. "I'll take you somewhere safe." The girl hesitated, looking at the outstretched hand as if it were a snake about to strike. Her eyes darted quickly between Richard's face and the busy street, clearly considering whether she should trust this stranger who moments before had destroyed her belongings. The businessman remained still, his hand still extended, feeling each second weigh like hours. Finally, Abigail stood up with difficulty, her thin legs trembling with the effort. She didn't take his hand, but stood beside him, still clutching the crumpled papers as if they were her only treasure in the world. As they walked towards the car, Richard wondered what the hell he was doing. His meticulously organized life had no room for that kind of complication. Still, something stronger than his reason prevented him from simply turning his back and walking away. The first stop was a children's shelter in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Richard had heard about the place through one of his secretaries, who occasionally did volunteer work. Throughout the journey, Abigail remained in absolute silence, sitting on the edge of the leather seat of the imported car, as if fearing to soil the upholstery with her grimy clothes. The shelter was an old building with peeling paint on the walls and a small, poorly maintained garden at the entrance. A faded sign announced St. Jude's Children's Home. Upon entering, they were greeted by a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor. Her kind face showed concern when she saw Abigail's condition. "Unfortunately, we don't have any vacancies at the moment," she said, after hearing Richard's hurried explanation. "The waiting list already has more than 30 children." Richard felt irritation rise. It was typical. Whenever he tried to do something decent, the world conspired to complicate things. He pulled his wallet from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out some high-denomination bills. "How much do you need to arrange a vacancy now?" Mrs. Eleanor seemed offended by the offer. "Sir, it's not a matter of money. We simply don't have the physical space. Our facilities—" "Then use this to create space," he interrupted, pushing the bills towards her. "Buy an extra mattress. Improvise something. Just don't tell me it's impossible." The shelter coordinator hesitated, looking at the money and then at Abigail, who remained standing like a small statue beside Richard. After a moment that seemed endless, she sighed and took the bills. "I'll see what I can do. Please, wait a moment." As Mrs. Eleanor walked away, Richard observed the environment around him. The place was clean, but clearly lacking resources. The walls needed painting, the furniture was old and worn, and through a half-open door he could see children sharing toys clearly worn out by use. Abigail remained silent, but her eyes scanned the room with a disturbing intensity. Richard noticed that she was clutching the papers even tighter against her chest, as if she feared someone would take them from her. After a few minutes, Mrs. Eleanor returned. "We managed to arrange an improvised bed in the girls' dormitory," she informed him. "It's not ideal, but it will do for now." Richard nodded, pleased to have solved the problem. He turned to Abigail, expecting to see some sign of relief on her face, but the girl remained with the same blank expression. "Well, then it's settled," he said, adjusting his tie. "She'll be fine here." Mrs. Eleanor approached Abigail with a gentle smile. "Come on, honey, we'll show you where you'll be sleeping. Then you can take a hot bath and have something to eat." It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. Abigail, who had until then shown no reaction, grabbed Richard's leg with a surprising strength for someone so small and fragile. The businessman was paralyzed, not knowing how to react. The girl's touch caught him completely off guard. How long had it been since someone had touched him like that, with such desperation and need? "Please," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "Don't leave me here." Richard felt something strange in his throat, as if something was stuck there. Carefully, he tried to disentangle himself from the girl's grip. "You'll be fine," he said, his voice sounding artificial even to his own ears. "They'll take care of you here." But Abigail didn't let go. Her little fingers clung to the fine fabric of Richard's pants like claws. When Mrs. Eleanor gently tried to pull her away, the girl began to cry. It wasn't a loud or manipulative cry. They were silent tears streaming down her thin face, accompanied by contained sobs that seemed to shake her entire fragile body. "You promised a safe place," she said between sobs. "This isn't safe." The words hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. He hadn't promised anything, or had he? His mind went back to the scene on the sidewalk, replaying the conversation. No, he had only said that he would take her to a safe place. But why did those words affect him so much now? "What do you mean it's not safe?" he asked, bending down to her height. "Mrs. Eleanor seems like a good person, and there are other children here." Abigail shook her head vehemently. "That's not it," she whispered, looking around as if she feared being overheard. It's just what?" Richard insisted, realizing that his initial irritation was being replaced by genuine concern. "It's just that you're not here," she finally replied, her voice so low that he could barely hear. The impact of those words was devastating. Richard felt as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. How was it possible that this child, whom he had met less than 2 hours ago, whom he had even assaulted by kicking her belongings, could trust him in this way? Mrs. Eleanor, who was watching the scene with an expression of maternal understanding, cleared her throat softly. "Perhaps," she began cautiously, "you'd like to spend some more time with her, help her to adapt." Richard found himself nodding, even before fully processing the suggestion. "Yes, maybe. Maybe that would be best." "You can visit her every day if you want," Mrs. Eleanor continued. "Many children adapt better when they have someone who—" But she didn't get to finish the sentence. A loud noise coming from the hallway interrupted the conversation. Children's screams echoed through the building, followed by the sound of something breaking. "Excuse me," Mrs. Eleanor said hurriedly, running towards the commotion. Richard and Abigail were left alone in the small office. The girl was still holding his leg, but the grip had loosened a little. He looked at her, noticing for the first time the details of her face, the almost invisible freckles on her nose, the small scar near her left eyebrow, the eyes that, despite the sadness, had a spark of intelligence that intrigued him. "You really don't want to stay here?" he asked, surprised by the softness in his own voice. Abigail shook her head negatively. A solitary tear rolled down her face, but she quickly wiped it away with the dirty sleeve of her coat. Richard found himself at a crossroads. His organized life, his important meetings, his unavoidable appointments, all of this flashed through his mind like a fast-forwarded movie. What he was about to do was crazy. It was irresponsible. It was... "All right," he heard himself saying. "You don't have to stay." Abigail's eyes widened, a spark of hope appearing in her gaze. "Really?" "Really," he replied, wondering if he had completely lost his mind, "but on one condition." "What?" she asked, still suspicious. "You're going to have to tell me your story. All of it. Why were you writing that on the sidewalk? Why do you say, 'It's not safe here, I need to know the truth'? Abigail's expression changed subtly. Something dark passed through her eyes, like a dark cloud on a sunny day. She clutched the papers even tighter against her chest and took a step back, finally releasing Richard's leg. "Some truths hurt a lot," she said, with a wisdom that didn't match her age. "Are you sure you want to know?" The drive back home was silent. Richard drove his luxury car through the streets of Chicago, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the small figure huddled in the back seat. Abigail kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching the city pass by as if she were memorizing every detail of the route. Upon arriving at the mansion in the Gold Coast neighborhood, Richard noticed the startled look of Patricia, his housekeeper of more than 15 years, when he walked in with Abigail. The girl seemed even smaller and more fragile next to the imposing furniture and expensive works of art that decorated the house. "Patricia, prepare a hot bath and get some clean towels," he ordered, trying to sound casual, as if bringing street children home was perfectly normal in his routine. "Yes, sir," Patricia replied, still stunned, her eyes alternating between her always so controlled boss and the dirty and ragged girl who accompanied him. "And see if you can find some clothes. Something that might fit her," he added, suddenly realizing that he had no idea what a child that age needed. As Patricia climbed the stairs to carry out the orders, Richard led Abigail to the kitchen. The girl walked carefully, as if she feared breaking something just with her presence. Her eyes scanned the room with a mixture of fascination and fear. "You must be hungry," he said, opening the refrigerator and realizing for the first time how devoid his house was of anything that might appeal to a child. "You don't have to worry," Abigail murmured, still clutching her crumpled papers. "I'm used to being hungry." Those words hit Richard like a slap. He closed the refrigerator more forcefully than necessary, causing Abigail to flinch instinctively. "No one should get used to being hungry," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "Patricia!" The housekeeper appeared almost instantly at the kitchen door. "Yes, sir?" "Call that Italian restaurant. Order some vegetable soup, some mac and cheese, and whatever else you think a child likes to eat." Patricia nodded and left to place the order, while Richard pulled out a chair for Abigail to sit down. The girl climbed with difficulty onto the high seat, still holding her papers as if they were a shield. "While the food is coming, how about telling me your story?" he suggested, sitting down across from her at the marble kitchen table. Abigail lowered her eyes to her crumpled papers. "You won't like to know," she murmured. "Why not?" "Because adults never like the truth. That's why they pretend they don't see children like me on the street." The cruel sincerity of those words made Richard squirm uncomfortably in his chair. How many times hadn't he pretended not to see? How many children like Abigail had he ignored over the years? "This time, it's different," he said, trying to sound convincing. "I want to know. I need to know." Abigail looked up, studying his face as if looking for signs of lying. After a moment that seemed endless, she began to speak, her voice low and hesitant. "Mom got sick when I was 4 years old. At first she could still work, clean houses, make food, but then she got very weak. Dad started drinking more. He said it was her fault, that she had done it on purpose." Abigail stopped, swallowing hard. Her little hands trembled as she smoothed the crumpled papers. "Go on," Richard encouraged, feeling a lump forming in his throat. "One day, Mom didn't wake up. Dad got very angry. He broke everything in the house, screamed a lot. Then he disappeared for 3 days. When he came back, he was different. He didn't talk to me anymore. He didn't look at me anymore. It was as if I didn't exist." Patricia returned to the kitchen at that moment, announcing that the food would arrive in 20 minutes. Richard barely registered her presence, focused on Abigail's story. "And then?" he asked, when Patricia left again. "Then he brought me to the city. He said he was going to get a better job, that we were going to live in a nice place. but he just left me sitting on that sidewalk and said he'd be right back. That was a long time ago." "How long?" Abigail shrugged. "I can't really count the days, but I saw the moon get full and wane many times." Richard made a quick mental calculation. Months. This child had been alone on the streets for months. "How did you survive all this time?" "People sometimes give food. There's a lady in a bakery who always saves yesterday's bread for me. And I learned to look in the right places, behind the restaurants, after they close." She stopped talking when Patricia entered again, this time announcing that the bath was ready. Richard noticed that the housekeeper had tears in her eyes. She had probably heard part of the conversation. "Let's do this," he said to Abigail. "You're going to take a hot bath, put on clean clothes, and then we'll continue our conversation while you eat." "Agreed." Abigail nodded slowly, but didn't move from the chair. "What is it?" he asked, noticing her hesitation. Can I take my papers?" "To the bath?" She nodded again, clutching the papers to her chest. "Why are they so important?" "Because they're the only things I have," she replied simply. "And because I wrote everything in them, everything that happened, everything I saw, everything I felt. If I lose them, I'll forget, and I can't forget." Richard felt something break inside him. How could such a small child carry such a weight? "No one is going to take your papers," he assured her. "You can leave them here on the table. I'll take care of them myself while you take a bath." Abigail hesitated for another moment, then placed the papers carefully on the table. Before following Patricia upstairs, she looked once more at Richard, her eyes carrying a mixture of hope and fear. When he was alone, Richard looked at the pile of crumpled and dirty papers. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the first one. The handwriting was irregular and childish, but still legible. He began to read and felt his whole world collapsing. "Dear Mommy in Heaven," the first text began. "It's very cold on the street today. My hands are numb and it's hard to hold the pen, but I need to write. I need to tell what happened after you left." Richard continued reading, each word like a small stab in his heart. The papers contained not only Abigail's story, but also her fears, her hopes, her observations about the world around her. There were drawings too, simple and shaky figures that portrayed her reality with a devastating rawness. In one of the papers, he found what appeared to be a list. At the top, in larger letters, was written, "Things I learned on the street." And then, in a series of items numbered with childish care, "Don't trust adults who offer candy. Always sleep near lights. Save a piece of bread for later. Don't cry where people can see. Pretend you're sleeping when bad men pass by. Never tell you're alone." The list went on, each item more devastating than the last. Richard had to stop reading several times, feeling his eyes burn in a way that hadn't happened in years. The sound of the doorbell startled him. The food had arrived. While Patricia received the delivery man, he continued his reading, unable to stop, despite the pain that each word caused him. It was then that he found the text that Abigail was writing when he found her on the sidewalk. It was incomplete, interrupted by his violent kick that had scattered the papers. "Today, I think I'm going to die. I can't stand being hungry anymore. My ribs are showing more and more, and my stomach hurts so much that I can't even sleep. But you know, Mommy, I'm not afraid. Maybe if I die, I can go meet you in heaven. And there must be food there, right? And it must be warm, too." The sound of light footsteps on the stairs made Richard quickly gather the papers, arranging them in a neat pile on the table. When Abigail entered the kitchen, he almost didn't recognize her. Patricia had done an impressive job. The girl was clean, with her hair still damp from the bath, combed and tied in a simple braid. She was wearing a t-shirt that, even being the smallest they could find, was still too big on her, falling like a dress over her diminutive form. "Feeling better?" he asked, trying to disguise the emotion he still felt after reading her writings. Abigail nodded shyly, climbing back onto the high chair. Her eyes immediately searched for the papers on the table, checking if they were all still there. Patricia began to serve the soup that had arrived, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. "Eat slowly," the housekeeper instructed gently. "Your stomach needs to get used to it gradually." But Abigail didn't start eating immediately. Instead, she stared at the steaming bowl as if it was something extraordinarily precious. Her little hands intertwined on her lap, and she closed her eyes for a moment. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, intrigued. "Saying thank you," she replied simply. "Mom always said we need to say thank you when we get food." Those simple words hit Richard hard. How many meals had he wasted over the years? How many times had he complained about the food in expensive restaurants, while children like Abigail were starving on the sidewalks? Did you read my papers?" she asked after a few spoonfuls of soup, noticing how he was looking at them. "I did," he admitted. "Sorry, I should have asked your permission." To his surprise, Abigail didn't seem upset. "It's okay. I write because I want someone to read it someday. I want people to know." "Know what?" "What it's like to be invisible." The simplicity of that answer made Richard grip the arm of the chair tightly. How could a 6-year-old child have so much awareness of her own condition? "You write very well for someone so young," he commented, trying to steer the conversation to something less painful. "Where did you learn?" "Mom taught me a little before she got too sick," Abigail replied between spoonfuls of soup. "After that, I kept looking at the letters on the signs, in the newspapers that people threw away. Sometimes, when I was very hungry, I pretended I was reading a fancy menu from those fancy restaurants." Patricia, who was organizing the kitchen, stopped what she was doing upon hearing this. Richard noticed that she was discreetly wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her uniform. "And why do you write so much about your mother?" he asked, remembering the letters he had read. Abigail lowered her spoon, her eyes suddenly distant. "Because I'm afraid of forgetting. Sometimes when I wake up, I can't quite remember her face. So I write everything I remember so I don't lose the memories." "And your father? Do you write about him too?" The girl visibly shuddered at the mention of her father. "Only sometimes," she murmured. "But it's different." "Different how?" "I write about Mom because I want to remember. I write about him because I want to forget." The silence that followed that declaration was heavy. Richard watched as Abigail continued eating her soup, each movement deliberate and careful, as if she were determined not to waste a single drop. "You said some truths hurt," he commented after a while. "What did you mean by that?" Abigail looked up from the bowl, and there was something in her gaze that made Richard instantly regret the question. "Do you really want to know?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I do." The girl pushed the soup bowl aside, still half full, and picked up one of the papers from the pile. Her small hands trembled slightly as she smoothed it out on the table. "This one," she said, "was the day Dad changed forever." Richard picked up the paper she indicated. The handwriting was shakier than usual, some words blurred by what appeared to be stains of old tears. "Dear Mommy," the text began, "today Dad found out that I kept your picture, the one we took in the park, remember? You were smiling and holding me in your arms. He got very angry. He said I couldn't have anything of yours, that you had abandoned us. I tried to explain that you didn't abandon us, that you were sick, but he wouldn't listen. He tore the picture in front of me and—" The text continued, but Richard couldn't go on. His hands were trembling so much that he was afraid of tearing the paper. "It was on that day," Abigail continued, her voice strangely calm, "that he started talking to himself. He would walk around the house saying that you had done it on purpose, that you had left him alone with a child he didn't want. He would drink that liquid that smelled strong and get angrier and angrier." Richard felt his stomach churn. "And what happened after that?" After that, he stopped buying food. He said he didn't have money, but he always had it to buy more of that liquid. I learned to take leftovers from school. I saved a little for when I got home. But then he lost his job and I couldn't go to school anymore. Patricia, who was still in the kitchen, dropped a pan, the metallic noise echoing through the room. Abigail flinched instinctively at the sound, her eyes instantly searching for an escape route. "It's okay," Richard assured quickly. "It was just an accident. You're safe here." The girl relaxed a little, but her eyes remained alert. "Was that when he brought you to Chicago?" "Yes, he said it would be different here, that he was going to get a better job. He said he had a friend who was going to help us." Abigail paused, fiddling with the hem of the oversized t-shirt. "But it was a lie. He just wanted to get rid of me." "How do you know?" "Because I saw him later, a few weeks after he left me, on the sidewalk. He was across the street watching me. Our eyes met, but he pretended he didn't know me and left. It was as if I had really become invisible." Richard felt a wave of anger so intense that he had to hold on so he wouldn't punch the table. How could someone be so cruel to their own daughter? "After that," Abigail continued, her voice getting lower and lower, "I started writing more. It was the only thing that made me feel like I still existed. When people passed by me without seeing me, I wrote about them. When I was very hungry, I wrote about food. When I felt very cold, I wrote about the sun." She stopped talking, picking up another paper from the pile. This one was particularly crumpled and dirty, as if it had been wet and dried several times. "This one," she said, "I wrote on the hardest day. It was when I realized that maybe it was better to give up." It was the text she was writing when Richard found her. The businessman felt his heart clench as he remembered how he had reacted, kicking her precious papers. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, "for kicking your papers. It was cruel of me." Abigail looked at him with an expression that seemed much older than her 6 years. "It's okay. At least you came back. Most people just walk right past." At that moment, Patricia returned to the kitchen with a cup of tea that she placed in front of Abigail. "To help you sleep," she explained with a gentle smile. But Abigail didn't take the cup. Instead, she looked at Richard with a worried expression. "Will I have to leave tomorrow?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The question caught Richard by surprise. He hadn't thought that far. He had been acting on impulse since the moment he found her on the sidewalk. "Why are you asking that?" "Because all places are temporary," she replied with a sad wisdom. "People help for a little bit, but then they send us away. That's how it works." Abigail's question hung in the air of the kitchen like a heavy cloud. Richard realized that Patricia was also awaiting his answer, although she tried to disguise it while organizing the dinner plates. The businessman ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture he often made when faced with a difficult decision. "No," he replied finally, "you don't have to leave tomorrow." Abigail's face lit up for a brief moment, but soon returned to its usual cautious expression. "Really? Even?" "Really," he confirmed, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice. "But we need to set some rules." Patricia stopped what she was doing, clearly interested in the conversation. Abigail straightened up in her chair, her small shoulders visibly tense. "What kind of rules?" she asked, almost whispering. "First," Richard began, "you need to promise me that you will eat right and rest. Your body needs to recover." Abigail nodded slowly. "Second, we're going to have to resolve your legal situation. I can't just keep a child in the house without proper documents or authorizations." The girl frowned, clearly confused by the terms. "And third," he continued, "you're going to have to trust me. I know it's difficult after everything you've been through, but I need you to try. Can you do that?" Abigail was silent for a long moment, as if she were carefully considering each word. Her fingers played nervously with the edge of the oversized t-shirt. "I can try," she replied finally. But, But you also have to promise me one thing." Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised. "What?" "Promise you won't pretend I don't exist, even when you have important visitors or when I do something wrong." The question hit Richard like a punch in the gut. How many times had this child been ignored, hidden, treated as an inconvenience? "I promise," he said firmly. "You will never be invisible again." Patricia sniffled audibly from across the kitchen, but when Richard looked in her direction, she had already turned away, pretending to be very busy with the cabinets. "Now," he continued, "I think it's time for you to rest. Patricia will show you to your room." "My room?" Abigail asked, her eyes widening. "I'm going to have a room all to myself." Of course," Richard replied, trying not to show how that question affected him. "Where else would you sleep?" "On the street I slept in cardboard boxes," she said naturally, as if she were commenting on the weather. "When it rained, I tried to find a marquee or a doorway. Sometimes, when I was lucky, I found a piece of plastic to cover myself." Patricia could no longer contain her tears and hurried out of the kitchen. Richard felt his throat tighten. "Well," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "here you will have a warm and comfortable bed, and you don't have to worry about rain or cold." Abigail got off the chair and picked up her papers from the table, hugging them to her chest as she always did. But before following Patricia, who had already returned more composed, she turned to Richard. "Can I tell you a secret?" she asked. "Sure. When I saw you today on the sidewalk, I was very scared at first. You seemed angry, like Dad when he drank. But then—" she hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Then," Richard encouraged, "then I saw your eyes. They were sad like mine. That's why I wrote that on the ground. I wanted to see if you would notice." With those words, she followed Patricia upstairs, leaving Richard alone in the kitchen, stunned by the perspicacity of that child who somehow had seen through all his carefully constructed defenses. Later that same night, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his king-size bed, his normally peaceful sleep disturbed by thoughts and worries that weren't usually part of his life. He got up and went to the room where Abigail was sleeping. The door was ajar, as Patricia had suggested, so that the girl wouldn't feel locked in or scared. Richard peeked through the crack and saw Abigail sleeping soundly, curled up in the blankets like a small cocoon. Her papers were carefully stacked on the bedside table. He silently entered the room and sat down in the armchair near the bed. In the soft light of the lamp, he watched Abigail's sleeping face. She looked so small, so fragile. How could someone abandon a child like that? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement. Abigail began to stir in the bed, her face contorting into an expression of anguish. She was having a nightmare. "No, please," she murmured, her little hands clutching the blanket tightly. "Don't leave me." Richard approached the bed, hesitant. He didn't know how to deal with children's nightmares. In fact, he didn't know how to deal with children in general, but something compelled him to try. "It's okay," he whispered, gently placing his hand on Abigail's head. "You're safe now." To his surprise, the touch seemed to calm the girl. Her breathing began to normalize, and her expression softened. But when Richard tried to pull his hand away, she gripped his fingers with surprising strength, still sleeping. And so he stayed, sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand trapped between Abigail's small fingers. The hours passed slowly as he watched the girl's now peaceful sleep, thinking about how his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. Suddenly, a noise in the hallway startled him. It was Patricia, who had apparently decided to start her chores earlier. "Sir," she whispered, surprised to find him there. "Is everything okay?" Richard signaled for her to speak more softly, indicating Abigail with a nod. "She had a nightmare," he explained in a low voice. Patricia smiled, a smile full of understanding and something else that Richard couldn't identify. "Did you stay here all night?" she asked. "She wouldn't let go of my hand," he replied, as if that explained everything. The housekeeper nodded, still smiling. "You know, sir, in all these years working here, I've never seen you like this." "Like what?" "Worried about someone other than yourself." Patricia's words, although said without malice, hit Richard hard. She was right. When was the last time he had really cared about someone? "She needs clothes," he said, changing the subject. "And other things. What do children her age need?" "I can make a list and go shopping today," Patricia offered. "Do that, and don't skimp. Buy everything the best. She's gone too long without anything." Patricia nodded and was about to leave when she stopped at the door. "Sir?" "Yes?" "What's going to happen when you have to go back to work? Your meetings, your trips?" The question caught Richard off guard. He hadn't thought about it. His life was completely structured around his career. Long hours at the office, frequent trips, unavoidable appointments. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll figure it out." At that moment, Abigail stirred in the bed, her fingers squeezing Richard's hand even tighter. He looked at that small hand clinging to his and knew with a certainty he couldn't explain that his life would never be the same. The first rays of sun began to enter through the window when Abigail finally released Richard's hand. He flexed his numb fingers, watching as the girl stretched slowly, her eyes blinking several times before focusing on his face. "Did you stay here all night?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from sleep. "You had a nightmare," he explained simply. Abigail sat up in bed, pulling her knees to her chest. "Sorry," she murmured. "Didn't mean to cause trouble." "It's not trouble," Richard replied, realizing that he really believed it. "How do you feel?" "Different," she said after a moment of reflection. "It's weird sleeping in a real bed after so long." Before Richard could respond, Patricia entered the room, carrying a tray with breakfast. The aroma of hot chocolate and fresh bread filled the room. "Good morning," said the housekeeper with a warm smile. "I thought you might be hungry." Abigail's eyes widened at the sight of the amount of food on the tray. There were breads, pastries, fruits, orange juice, and a large steaming cup of hot chocolate. This is all for me?" she asked, incredulous. "Of course," Patricia replied, placing the tray on a small table near the bed. "And there's more in the kitchen if you want." Abigail looked at Richard as if asking permission. He nodded, encouraging her. "You can eat as much as you want, but remember what Patricia said yesterday, slowly, so your stomach gets used to it." The girl took a piece of bread with almost reverential care. Her small hands trembled slightly as she brought it to her mouth. The first piece was chewed slowly, savoring every moment. "After breakfast," Richard said, "Patricia will take you to buy some things, new clothes, shoes, whatever else you need." Abigail stopped chewing, looking at him with concern. "You're not coming?" "I have some things to take care of at the office," he explained, "but I'll be back for lunch." Abigail's face suddenly turned pale. She put the bread back on the plate, her appetite apparently disappearing. "You're really coming back?" she asked, in a low voice. "Promise?" Richard felt his heart clench. Of course she would be afraid of being abandoned again. "I promise," he said firmly, "and to prove it, I'm going to give you this." He took off his Rolex watch, a very expensive piece that he rarely removed. He placed it on the small table next to Abigail's bed. "See, it's 8 o'clock now. I'll be back when the big hand is on the 12 and the small hand is on the 1 o'clock in the afternoon." Abigail looked at the watch with curiosity. "I don't know how to tell time," she admitted. "Patricia will teach you," Richard replied. "And when I come back, you can show me that you've learned." The girl seemed to consider the proposal for a moment, her eyes alternating between the watch and Richard's face. "What if you don't come back?" she asked finally. "Then you can keep the watch," he replied, "but it's not going to happen because I always keep my promises." That answer seemed to satisfy Abigail, who returned to eating her bread, although she still cast occasional glances at the watch. Richard got up, feeling his muscles protest after the uncomfortable night in the armchair. Before leaving the room, however, he turned to Patricia. "Buy everything she needs," he instructed, "and some more things, books, toys, drawing and writing supplies, and something to store those papers of hers too, a nice folder or an album." Patricia nodded, making mental notes, but as Richard was about to leave, Abigail's voice stopped him. "Wait," she called. "Can I show you something before you go?" He took a few steps back. Abigail picked up her papers from the bedside table and looked for something specific among them. "Here," she said, extending a particularly crumpled sheet. "I wrote this last night after you fell asleep." Richard took the paper carefully. The handwriting was a little firmer than in the other texts, as if she had made a special effort to make nice handwriting. "Dear Mommy in heaven, today something different happened. Remember I always told you about the people who passed by me without looking? Today someone looked. At first he seemed angry, like Dad, but then he changed. He has sad eyes like mine, but he also has something else. Something that makes the sadness hurt less. Now I'm in a big house, in a warm bed, There's a lady named Patricia who smiles like you smiled and makes food that smells as good as yours. And there's him, the man with the sad eyes. He promises he'll be back, but I don't know if I believe it. People always promise things. But, you know, Mommy, even if he doesn't come back, today was a good day. Because today, someone really saw me, and that's already more than I had yesterday." Richard needed a few moments to be able to speak after reading the text. "You really think I have sad eyes?" he asked finally. "Yes," Abigail replied simply. "But it's not bad. People with sad eyes understand other sad people better." The wisdom of that observation left Richard momentarily speechless. How could a child who had suffered so much maintain this capacity for understanding, this sensitivity? "I'll be back," he said firmly. "And when I come back, I want to see what else you've written." Abigail smiled, a small and hesitant smile, but real. It was the first time Richard had seen her smile since he found her. In the car, on the way to the office, he couldn't stop thinking about Abigail's text. "Someone really saw me." The words echoed in his mind. How many other children like her went unnoticed every day? How many stories like hers were never told because no one stopped to listen? His phone rang, bringing him back to reality. It was his secretary, reminding him of the important meeting he had in half an hour with foreign investors. A meeting that would normally be his absolute priority. "Cancel it," he said, surprising himself with his own decision. "But sir," the secretary protested, "it's the Japanese investors. They came from so far away." "Reschedule it for next week. Actually, reschedule all appointments for today. I have something more important to take care of." He hung up the phone and made a U-turn at the first intersection. There was a shopping mall nearby, one of those really big and luxurious ones. If Abigail needed new things, he would choose them himself. Patricia was efficient, but she didn't know the girl's tastes. In fact, he didn't know either, but somehow he felt he needed to do this personally. He parked the car and entered the mall as soon as the stores started to open. He had never been to a toy store before. It was a completely new world for him. The saleswomen looked at him curiously as he examined dolls, games, and children's books. "Can I help you?" one of them offered, approaching with a professional smile. "Yes," he replied. "I need everything." The saleswoman raised her eyebrows. "Everything? Everything a 6-year-old girl might want or need. And drawing and writing supplies too. She likes to write a lot. Do you know what she likes? Favorite colors, characters? Richard realized he didn't know any of that. He knew Abigail's fears, her sadnesses, her painful memories. But he didn't know what colors made her smile. What stories made her dream. I don't know, he admitted, but I want to find out. 2 hours later, the trunk and back seat of Richard's car were completely full. In addition to clothes, shoes, and school supplies, he had bought an absurd amount of toys, children's books, and art supplies. The saleswoman at the toy store had been especially helpful, helping him choose items suitable for different ages and interests. But it was in the bookstore that Richard got completely lost. He remembered how Abigail wrote, even with an almost inkless pen, on pieces of paper found in the trash. He bought notebooks of all kinds, some with colorful and decorated covers, others simpler and more elegant. Pens, pencils, erasers, all of the best quality. In the stationery section, he found a hardcover album, bound in dark blue leather, with thick and resistant pages. It was perfect for storing Abigail's writings, preserving those memories that she so feared losing. He looked at his watch, not the Rolex, which he had left with Abigail, but a simpler one that he kept in the car. He still had time before the promised time to return. He decided to make one more stop. The children's furniture store was on the top floor of the mall. Richard had never been in there before, but now he had a clear purpose. The room where Abigail was sleeping was one of the guest rooms, elegant but cold and impersonal. She deserved her own space, a place she could really call her own. "I'm looking for a bed," he said to the saleswoman who came to assist him. "Something special." The woman led him through the showroom, showing different models. Richard stopped in front of a bed that looked like it came out of a fairy tale. It was made of light wood, with delicate carvings forming flowers and leaves. The canopy was covered by a light and airy fabric, creating a small private haven. "It's perfect," he said. "I want this. And I also need a desk, bookshelves, and anything else a child might need in her room." While the saleswoman arranged the purchase documentation and organized the delivery for that same afternoon, Richard received a call from Patricia. "Sir," she said, sounding worried, "I think you better come back soon." "What happened?" he asked, feeling his heart race. "Is Abigail okay? She's different. She didn't want to try on any clothes. She barely touched her breakfast after you left. She keeps looking at that watch all the time, as if she were expecting to be disappointed again." Richard looked at his own watch. There was still an hour before the time he had promised. "I'm coming back now," he said, ending the call. On the way home with the car full of presents, Richard found himself thinking about how his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. The day before, his biggest concern was closing a multi-million-dollar deal. Now his heart was tight with worry for a little girl who was waiting for him, counting the minutes on a watch she barely knew how to read. Upon arriving home, he found Abigail exactly where Patricia had said, sitting on the bed, staring at the Rolex in her small hands. She looked up when he entered the room, and the relief on her face was so evident that it hurt. "You came back," she said, as if she didn't totally believe it. "I promised I would come back," he replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "And I'm still early? See that the little hand hasn't reached the one yet?" Abigail nodded. "Patricia taught me. She said each big number is 5 minutes, and when the big hand goes all the way around, an hour has passed." "Very good," he praised. "Now how about coming downstairs with me? I brought some things for you." The girl hesitated. "What kind of things?" "Come and see." Abigail got out of bed slowly, still holding the watch. She followed Richard to the garage, where he had parked the car. When he opened the trunk, revealing the bags and packages, her eyes widened. This is all for me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "All of it," he confirmed. "Want to start opening?" Abigail took a step back, shaking her head. "I can't," she said. "It's too much. Nobody ever—" Her voice trailed off, and Richard noticed that she was trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" he asked, bending down to her height. "Don't you like it?" "It's not that," she replied, still trembling. It's that what? It's that when people give a lot of things, then they want something in return. And when we can't give them what they want, they get angry." Richard felt as if someone had thrown a bucket of cold water on him. What kind of experiences had this child had to think like that? "Abigail," he said firmly, "look at me." The girl looked up hesitantly. "These things are yours. No conditions, no strings attached, no nothing in return. They're yours because you deserve to have beautiful and new things, because every child deserves it." "Really?" she asked, her voice tiny. And you know why else I bought all this?" She shook her head. "Because I want to get to know you better. I want to know what you like, what colors you prefer, what stories make you smile. I want you to have choices, many choices. Because you've spent too long without being able to choose anything in your life." A tear rolled down Abigail's face, but this time she didn't wipe it away quickly as she usually did. Instead, she took a small step forward and, to Richard's complete surprise, hugged him. It was a brief and hesitant hug, but charged with meaning. When she pulled away, there was a different sparkle in her eyes, something that looked a lot like hope. "Can I see what's in the bags?" she asked shyly. "Of course," he replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "Where do you want to start?" Abigail looked at the amount of bags and packages, clearly overwhelmed. Then her eyes landed on a bag from the bookstore. "There," she pointed. "That one with the books." Richard smiled. Of course she would choose the writing materials first. He picked up the bag and placed it on the floor between them. "Let's see what we have here," he said, starting to take out the items. Abigail's face lit up with each new notebook, each set of pens, each block of colored paper that emerged from the bag. But when Richard took out the blue-covered album, she became absolutely still. "This," he said, handing her the album, "is to store your writings, so you never have to be afraid of losing them or getting them ruined in the rain again." Abigail took the album as carefully as if it were made of crystal. She ran her fingers over the leather cover, opened it slowly, felt the texture of the pages. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she whispered. The rest of the afternoon was spent unpacking the purchases. Each new discovery provoked different reactions in Abigail, from shy smiles to silent tears, especially when she found a rag doll that vaguely resembled her mother, with long dark hair and a flowered dress. Patricia helped them, organizing the new clothes in the closet and separating the school supplies. The housekeeper seemed as emotional as Abigail with each new discovery, although she tried to disguise her commotion. It was in the middle of this activity that the doorbell rang. It was the delivery of the new furniture. "More things?" Abigail asked, her eyes wide. "These are special," Richard replied. "They're for your new room." "New room?" "Yes, the one where you slept is a guest room. You deserve your own space, decorated your way." The delivery men began to come up with the disassembled pieces. Abigail watched everything with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "But what about my papers?" she asked, clearly worried about her most precious belongings. "We'll keep them safe with all care," Richard assured. "And when your new room is ready, you'll have a special place for them." The furniture assembly took the rest of the afternoon. Abigail alternated between watching the men working and organizing her new belongings with Patricia. From time to time, Richard caught her looking at the Rolex, as if she still needed to make sure that all this was real. When the room was finally ready, it was already getting dark. The canopy bed occupied the center of the space, like a small private castle. The bookshelves, still empty, waited to be filled with books and toys. The desk was near the window, allowing her to write with natural light. "What do you think?" Richard asked, watching as Abigail explored every corner of the room. It's like a dream," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of waking up, of finding out that none of this is real." Richard felt his heart clench. He approached her and knelt down to her height. "It's real, Abigail. All this is real and it's yours. No one will take it away from you." The girl looked at him with her big dark eyes, full of a wisdom too sad for her age. "Promise? I promise." She nodded slowly, then walked to the new desk. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the wood, as if she didn't believe she could touch something so beautiful. "Can I write here?" she asked timidly. "Of course. It's your desk. You can write whenever and whatever you want." Abigail picked up one of the new notebooks and a pen. She sat in the chair, which was a little too high for her, causing her feet to swing without touching the floor, and began to write. Richard and Patricia exchanged glances and silently left the room, leaving her in her private moment with the words. "She's special, isn't she?" Patricia commented when they reached the hallway. "Yes," Richard replied, still looking at the bedroom door. "More than we imagine." After some time, Patricia called Abigail to dinner. The girl came down reluctantly, as if she feared that her new room would disappear in her absence. During the meal, she ate a little more than at breakfast, although still in very small quantities for a child her age. Richard noticed that she occasionally touched the Rolex, which she still carried with her, as if she needed to make sure it was still there. "Tomorrow," he said as they ate, "we need to take care of a few things." Abigail immediately tensed, her spoon stopping halfway to her mouth. "What things?" "First, we need to go to a doctor, get some checkups, see how your health is." The girl paled visibly. "I don't like doctors," she murmured. "Why?" "Because it was in a hospital that she—" Abigail couldn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. "I understand," Richard said, gently. "But this doctor is different. She's a friend of mine, very good. She'll take care of you." "Will you be there?" Abigail asked, her voice small and scared. "I'll be with you the whole time," he assured. That seemed to calm the girl down a bit, and she went back to eating her soup. "And then?" she asked after a few moments. "Then we need to go to a few places to get your documents, so you can stay here legally." Abigail frowned, clearly confused by the terms. "It's so no one can take you away," he explained. "So you can stay here with me, officially." Her eyes widened. "You really want me to stay? Forever?" "I do," he replied firmly. "If you want to, too." Abigail was silent for a long moment, playing with the spoon in her plate. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. The question surprised Richard. It wasn't the answer he expected from a child who had spent so long alone. "Of course you can," he replied. "You can think as long as you need." Later, when Patricia had already retired for the night and the house was quiet, Richard heard sounds coming from Abigail's room. He approached the door silently and found her still writing at her new desk. "Shouldn't you be sleeping?" he asked softly. Abigail startled slightly, but relaxed when she saw it was him. "I can't sleep," she admitted. "I have a lot to write." "Can I see?" She hesitated for a moment, then extended the notebook to him. The handwriting was firmer now, benefiting from the stable surface of the desk and the new pens. "Dear Mommy, so many things happened today that I hardly know where to start. Remember when you used to tell me that sometimes angels disguise themselves as normal people to help those in need? I think I found one of them. He gave me a room all to myself, Mommy. It has a bed that looks like it belongs to a princess and a desk just for me to write. He also gave me new notebooks, lots of them." and a beautiful album to store my stories. But you know what's strangest? He wants me to stay forever. He said he's going to take care of me, that no one will take me away. I'm scared, Mommy. What if it's a lie? What if one day he gets tired of me like Dad got tired? But I'm also afraid of saying no and going back to the street. What would you do? How do you know when you can trust someone? He has sad eyes, as I told you, but today I saw something different in them. When he smiles, the sadness disappears a little. Is that how happiness starts? Little by little. Help me decide, Mummy. Send a sign, those ones you said the angels send when we need help. With love, Abigail. Richard finished reading, feeling his eyes burn. He returned the notebook to Abigail, who was watching him intently. Your mother would be proud, he said. You write very well. Do you think she can hear me? Abigail asked. Up in heaven? I'm sure she can. Abigail nodded, closing the notebook carefully. You know, she said after a moment, I think she already sent a sign. Really? What? You, Abigail replied simply. When I was writing that on the sidewalk, thinking about giving up, you showed up. Even though you were angry at first, you came back. Nobody ever comes back. The next morning dawned cold and grey. Richard found Abigail already awake, sitting in her new bed, hugging the rag doll she had liked so much. She was still wearing the oversized t-shirt that Patricia had improvised as a nightgown, and her bare feet swung nervously on the edge of the bed. Did you sleep well? He asked, entering the room. Abigail nodded, although the dark circles under her eyes suggested otherwise. Are you ready to go to the doctor? The girl clutched the doll tighter to her chest. Do I really have to go? Yes, he replied gently. We need to know if you're okay. How long has it been since you've been to a doctor? Abigail frowned, thoughtful. Since before Mom got sick, I think. Richard felt his heart clench. Years, without any medical care, living on the streets, starving. Let's get ready then, he suggested. Patricia picked out some new clothes for you. Abigail looked at the clothes folded on the chair. A light blue dress, white leggings, a pink fleece, jacket and light brown boots. Everything still with tags. Can I take my doll? She asked hesitantly. Of course you can. Patricia helped Abigail get dressed while Richard waited in the hallway. When the girl came out of the room, she looked like a different person. The new clothes, although still a little big for her thin body, gave her an appearance of normalcy that contrasted painfully with the reality of her situation. In the car, Abigail remained silent, clutching her doll, occasionally touching the Rolex that she still carried with her. Richard noticed that she was watching the road intently, as if she were memorizing every detail of the route. The private clinic where he had scheduled the appointment was in an upscale neighborhood in Chicago. The building was modern and elegant, with a reception area that looked more like a five-star hotel. As soon as they entered, Abigail moved closer to Richard, clearly intimidated by the environment. Her small fingers closed around the hem of his coat, a gesture that he was already beginning to recognize as a sign of her nervousness. Dr. Bennett is waiting, the receptionist informed with a professional smile, although her eyes showed curiosity at seeing the powerful businessman accompanied by a child who was clearly frail. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a gentle expression, greeted them in her office. Richard had known her for years. She had taken care of his mother during her last illness. So this is Abigail, she said, bending down to be at the girl's height. What a beautiful doll you have there. Abigail didn't answer, hiding partially behind Richard. It's okay, the doctor assured. We're not going to do anything you don't want. First, we'll just talk a little. How about that? Gradually, with a lot of patience, Dr. Bennett managed to gain Abigail's trust. She started by asking simple questions about the doll, then about the new clothes, until finally reaching the important questions about her health. The physical exam was the hardest part. Abigail trembled visibly when she had to let go of Richard's hand to get on the examination table. But the doctor was gentle and careful, explaining each procedure before performing it. After the initial exams, Dr. Bennett asked to speak with Richard in private. Abigail immediately panicked. "No," she cried, grabbing Richard's leg. "Don't leave me!" "It will only be a minute," he assured. "You can stay here with your doll, drawing on that paper over there. I promise I'll be right back." "Really promise?" "Of course. Look," he said, pointing to the watch on her small hands. "When the big hand goes all the way around, I'll be back." Abigail looked at the watch, then at him, clearly in conflict. Finally, she nodded reluctantly and went to sit at the small table that the doctor had prepared with paper and colored pencils. In the hallway, Dr. Bennett assumed a serious expression. "She's severely malnourished," she began bluntly. "Her weight and height are well below what is expected for her age. There are signs of multiple vitamin deficiencies, and I suspect severe anemia." Richard felt his stomach churn. "But she can get better, can't she?" "Yes, with proper care. I'll need several blood tests, but I'm already going to prescribe an initial supplementation. The most worrying, however, are the emotional aspects." "How so?" "She shows clear signs of psychological trauma. The fear of abandonment is evident, as well as behaviors typical of those who have experienced situations of abuse or severe neglect." Richard clenched his fists tightly, feeling the anger grow again as he thought about Abigail's father. "What can we do?" "First, establish a stable routine. She needs to feel safe, to know that her basic needs will be consistently met. Then, I strongly recommend psychological counseling. Can you recommend someone? I have a colleague who specializes in child trauma. I'll pass on her contact information, but Richard..." She hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure about this? Caring for a traumatized child isn't easy. It will require a lot of time, patience, dedication." "I'm sure," he replied without hesitation. "She's not going back to the streets. Never again." When they returned to the office, they found Abigail exactly where they had left her, drawing intently. Upon seeing Richard, her face lit up with visible relief. "You came back," she exclaimed, running to him. "Of course I came back. I promised, didn't I?" Abigail nodded, taking his hand with the familiarity of someone who already trusted that gesture. "Look what I drew," she said, pulling him to the table. The drawing showed 3 figures: a woman with long hair and a flowered dress, a little girl holding hands with a man in a suit. Underneath, she had written with her childish handwriting, "Mommy in heaven, me and my angel." Richard felt his throat tighten. "It's very beautiful," he managed to say. "Can I take it home?" she asked, "to put in my new album?" "Of course you can. It's yours." On the way home, Abigail slept in the back seat of the car, still clutching her doll. The drawing was carefully folded in her lap. Richard watched her in the rearview mirror, thinking about everything the doctor had said. It wouldn't be easy, she was right. But looking at that small, sleeping figure, so fragile and yet so resilient, he knew he would do anything to help her overcome her traumas. His phone vibrated. It was his secretary, reminding him of the important meeting he had rescheduled for that afternoon. Normally, he would never miss an appointment like that. But now, looking at Abigail, sleeping peacefully for the first time since he had met her, the decision was easy. "Cancel it," he said simply. "Actually, cancel all appointments this week. I have something more important to do." He hung up the phone and continued driving, his mind already planning the next steps. They needed to resolve the issue of her documents, find a good therapist, establish a routine. But first, he would let Abigail sleep for as long as she needed. The following weeks were a period of adaptation for everyone in the house. Patricia completely reorganized her routine to accommodate Abigail's needs. preparing special meals at the times recommended by the doctor and helping the girl get used to a normal life again. Richard, in turn, did something he had never imagined possible. He started working from home. He transformed one of the empty rooms into an office, from where he conducted his meetings by video conference and managed his business remotely. His partners and employees were shocked by the change, but he didn't care. The priority now was different. One morning, while working in his new office, he heard hesitant knocks on the door. "Come in," he said, imagining it would be Patricia with more coffee. But it was Abigail who entered, carrying her blue album and looking nervous. "Am I bothering you?" she asked shyly. "Never," he replied, closing the laptop. "What's wrong?" Abigail approached the desk, placing the album on it carefully. "I wanted to show you something," she said. "I spent the night organizing." Richard pulled up a chair for her to sit next to him. Abigail opened the album, revealing its pages now, filled with the old papers, carefully glued and organized by date. "Patricia helped me," she explained. "She said that way it's easier to find each story." The pages were organized chronologically, starting with the first writings after her mother's death. Some papers were so crumpled and stained that you could barely read the text, but Abigail had rewritten each word next to it, with her handwriting now firmer and clearer. "See?" she said, pointing to a specific date. "This was the day Dad left me on the sidewalk, and this," she turned a few pages, "was when I met you." Richard observed the progression of the stories, noting how Abigail's writing had evolved. The most recent texts occupied the last pages of the album, written directly on the quality paper, without stains or tears. "I still write to Mom every day," she said, "but now the stories are different." "Different how?" "Less sad," she replied. "Simply, before I only wrote about hunger, cold, and fear. Now I can write about good things too." Richard felt his heart clench. "What kind of good things?" Abigail flipped through the album to the last entry, written the night before. "Dear Mummy, today it's been a month since my life changed. A month since someone stopped to really see me. Patricia taught me how to make cookies today. My hands got all covered in flour, but it didn't matter because afterwards I could take a bath with warm water and soap that smells like flowers. You would have liked the smell, Mommy. My room is still here. I still check every morning when I wake up just to make sure. The bed is so soft that sometimes I'm afraid I'm dreaming. But then I look at the watch he gave me, the pretty one I wear, every day, and I know it's true. I went to the doctor again today. She said I'm gaining weight, that my cheeks are less sunken. It didn't hurt at all this time, and afterwards I got a strawberry lollipop. But you know what's most different, Mummy? I'm not as scared anymore. Sure, I still get scared sometimes, especially when there's thunder or when someone speaks very loudly. But it's different now, because I'm not alone anymore. He always comes back, Mummy. Always. When he promises he'll be back in an hour, he comes back in an hour. When he says he's just going to work in that room next door, the door stays open so I can see that he hasn't left. Is that how a real dad is supposed to be?" Richard needed a few moments to be able to speak after reading the text. Do you see me that way?" he asked finally. "As a father?" Abigail lowered her eyes, playing with the edge of the album. "I don't know," she murmured. "I never had a real dad. The one I had left me on the street." "What if—" Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "What if I wanted to be a dad, for real, officially?" Abigail looked up quickly, surprised. "What do you mean?" "There's a process called adoption," he explained. "It means I would legally become your father. You would have my last name. You would be my daughter for all intents and purposes. But what if you change your mind later?" "I'm not going to change my mind, Abigail. When adoption happens, it's forever. No one can undo it." The girl was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Could I call you Dad?" she asked finally, her voice almost a whisper. "If you want to," he replied, feeling his own voice fail. "But it doesn't have to be now. It can be when you feel ready." Abigail nodded slowly, then picked up a pen from Richard's desk. "Can I write about it?" she asked. "To Mommy?" "Of course." She opened a new page in the album and began to write, her handwriting careful and concentrated. "Dear Mommy, today something happened that I never thought was possible. Remember when you said that sometimes we lose something to gain something, else that life has a funny way of fixing things? I think I understood what you meant. Because today, the man you sent to save me wants to be my dad. For real, forever. I'm still a little scared, Mommy. But it's a different kind of fear. It's not fear of being abandoned or starving anymore. It's fear of being too happy, of waking up and finding out it was all a dream. But you know what? I think I'm going to risk it. Because you always said we have to be brave when happiness knocks on the door. Would you be angry if I called him Dad? Is it possible to have two dads? One in heaven and one here on earth? With love, your Abigail." When she finished writing, Abigail stared at the page for a long moment. Then slowly she turned to Richard. "Can I try something?" she asked. "What?" "Dad," she said, testing the word as if it was something fragile and precious. "Can I call you Dad?" Richard felt tears run down his face, but he didn't try to hide them. "You can," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "You can call me whatever you want." Abigail got up from her chair and, for the first time since she had arrived, hugged him of her own accord. It was a tight, desperate hug, as if she were trying to make up for all the hugs she had never had. "Dad," she repeated, her voice muffled, against his chest. "My dad." The following months were of intense changes. The adoption process required a series of documents and legal procedures that consumed a good part of Richard's time. But he didn't care. Each paper signed, each declaration obtained, was a step closer to making Abigail officially his daughter. The girl continued her sessions with the psychologist Dr. Miller, who had been recommended by Dr. Bennett. At first, Abigail resisted the idea of talking to a stranger, but little by little, she began to open up. The therapist had a special way of working, using drawings and stories to help Abigail process her traumas. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Abigail left the office quieter than usual. In the car, during the drive back home, she remained silent, hugging her inseparable doll. "Is everything okay?" Richard asked, worried about her state. "Dad," she said, still testing the word that she now used more frequently. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why were you angry that day, when you saw me writing on the sidewalk?" The question caught Richard by surprise. It was something he had been questioning himself ever since. I think I was angry with myself," he replied after a moment of reflection. "Seeing you there reminded me of things that I was trying to forget." "What things?" Richard took a deep breath. It was the first time he had considered telling his own story to Abigail. "Oh, when I was a kid," he began, "I also went hungry, not as long as you, but long enough to never forget what it's like." Abigail leaned forward in her seat, clearly interested. "Really? Really? My father abandoned us when I was little. My mother tried to work in several places, but she got sick often. Sometimes we didn't have anything to eat. And what happened after that? I got lucky. A teacher noticed my situation and helped me. He got me a scholarship, then an internship. That's how I started building my life." "Is that why you helped me?" Abigail asked. "Because you were also hungry?" "Maybe," he replied honestly. "But I think it was more than that. When I saw you writing that on the sidewalk, something inside me broke down, as if all the walls I had built over the years had collapsed at once." Abigail was silent for a moment, processing the information. Dr. Miller said that sometimes the most hurt people are the ones who help others the most, she commented, because they know how it hurts. Richard felt his heart clench with the wisdom of that observation. Your therapist seems very smart, he said. She is, Abigail confirmed. Today she asked me to draw my family. And what did you draw? First I drew Mommy in heaven like I always do. Then I drew you, me and Patricia. Dr. Miller asked why I didn't draw my other dad. And what did you say? I said he's not my real dad. Real dads don't abandon. Richard had to grip the steering wheel tighter to control the emotion he felt. You know, Abigail continued, sometimes I still dream about him. I dream that I'm on that sidewalk again, waiting for him to come back. But now, when I wake up scared, I remember that I have you. When they got home, Patricia was waiting for them with afternoon snacks prepared. There were freshly baked cookies, Abigail's favorites, and hot chocolate. Look what came for you, Patricia said, handing a large envelope to Abigail. What is it? The girl asked, looking curiously at the official envelope. Open it and find out, encouraged Richard, who already knew the contents. Abigail opened the envelope carefully, as she did with everything she received. Inside was a document with gold lettering, her complete school transcript needed for enrollment in her new school. Does this mean I'm going to be able to study? She asked, her eyes shining. Yes, Richard confirmed. Everything is already settled. You start next week. Abigail hugged the document to her chest, as she did with her precious writings. Can I write about it? She asked, already heading for the stairs. Of course, Richard replied, smiling. But first have your snack. Remember what Dr. Bennett said about not skipping meals. Abigail returned to the table, sitting in her usual place. While eating the cookies, her eyes didn't leave the document. Dad? She called after a moment. Yes? What if the other kids don't like me? What if they find out that I used to live on the street? Richard sat next to her, choosing his words carefully. Abigail, look at me, he asked. You are an amazing girl, intelligent, sensitive, talented. Your past doesn't define who you are. It just shows how strong you are for having overcome all that. But what if they laugh at me? Then they'll be missing out on the chance to meet someone special. Besides, he added with a smile, you write better than most adults I know. That brought a small smile to Abigail's face. Can I take my album to school? She asked, to give me courage. You can, but take care of it. I know how important it is to you. After the snack, Abigail went up to her room. Richard found her, later sitting at her desk, writing intently in her album. Dear Mommy, today I found out I'm going to school, for real, with a uniform and everything. Patricia said she's going to help me organize my supplies, and Dad promised he's going to take me and pick me up every day. I'm a little scared, Mommy. What if I can't keep up with the classes? It's been so long since I studied, but Dad said he's going to help me, that I can have tutoring if I need it. You know what's coolest? I'm going to be able to write even more. The teacher is going to teach English, writing, all those things that you said were important. Sometimes I wonder if you would be proud of me, if you would approve of the changes in my life. Would you like the dad I found? He's different from the other one. He doesn't drink that liquid that smells strong. He doesn't shout. He doesn't disappear. Today, he told me that he also went hungry when he was little. That made me think, do we only help others when we know how it hurts? If that's the case, I think when I grow up, I want to help other children who are alone, so they can also find a family. It's strange, Mommy, but for the first time I'm not afraid of the future. It's like I can finally dream about tomorrow, you know? With love, your Abigail, who is also going to be Abigail Mendez. That's going to be my name when the adoption is over. The first day of school arrived faster than they expected. Abigail woke up before sunrise, already dressed in her new uniform. Patricia found her sitting on the bed, organizing and reorganizing her backpack for the 10th time. "Have you checked everything again?" the housekeeper asked with a gentle smile. "I think so," Abigail replied nervously. "Notebooks, pencils, eraser, my album." "And did you have breakfast?" Abigail shook her head. "My stomach feels weird." "It's normal to be nervous," Patricia said, sitting next to her. "But you need to eat something. How about those pancakes you like?" Before Abigail could answer, Richard appeared at the door, already dressed for work. "Ready?" he asked. "I think so," Abigail replied, although her voice trembled slightly. "Then, let's have breakfast. We can't be late on the first day." In the kitchen, Patricia had prepared a special breakfast. There were pancakes with syrup, fresh fruit cut into fun shapes, and hot chocolate with marshmallows, Abigail's new favorite drink. The girl ate little, but made an effort to please Patricia and Richard, who insisted on the importance of breakfast. Her eyes constantly turned to the clock on the wall, no longer Richard's Rolex, which she had finally returned, but a pretty sun-shaped clock that decorated the kitchen. In the car, on the way to school, Abigail was restless. Her fingers played nervously with the strap of her backpack as she looked out the window. "What if I can't make friends?" she asked for the third time that morning. "You will," Richard assured. "Just be yourself." "But what if they find out, that you used to live on the street?" he finished gently. "Abigail, look at me." The girl turned in her seat, her big, dark eyes fixed on him. "Your past is part of who you are, but it doesn't define your future. If someone finds out and is mean to you, let me know. But don't let the fear of what they might think stop you from being happy." Abigail nodded slowly, then took her album from her backpack. "I brought this to give me courage," she said. "Can I read a little before we go in?" "Of course." She opened to a specific page. Richard recognized it as one of the first she had written after moving in with him. "Dear Mommy, today I learned a new word, fresh start." Patricia explained to me that it means starting again, having a new chance. She said it's like being born again, but being able to choose some things. I liked that word, Mommy, because that's what's happening to me. A fresh start, and this time I'm not alone. "Why did you choose that specific page?" Richard asked, curious. "Because today is another fresh start," she replied. "And I wanted to remember that I'm not alone." When they arrived at the school, the yard was full of children and parents. Abigail squeezed Richard's hand tightly as they walked to the classroom. The teacher, a young woman named Ms. Evans, greeted them with a warm smile. Richard had already spoken to her previously, explaining Abigail's situation briefly. "Welcome," she said to Abigail. "How about meeting your new classmates?" Abigail looked at Richard, clearly hesitant to let go of his hand. "It's going to be okay," he assured. "I'll pick you up after school. At the same time the clock will show, remember?" She nodded, took a deep breath, and, with a courage that surprised him, let go of his hand and followed the teacher into the classroom. Richard stood watching through the window for a few minutes. He saw Abigail sit at a desk near the window, take her album from her backpack and place it on the table like a protective talisman. A girl with colorful braids approached, apparently interested in the blue-covered album. Abigail seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then flashed a small smile and began talking to her classmate. It was only then that Richard was able to leave, his heart divided between worry and pride. In the afternoon, when he returned to pick up Abigail, he found her talking animatedly with the same girl with the colorful braids. Her eyes shone in a way he had never seen before. "Dad!" she exclaimed upon seeing him, running towards him. "You're not going to believe what happened." "Tell me," he said, taking her backpack. "The teacher asked everyone to tell a story. When it was my turn, I got scared, but then I remembered what you said about being myself. So I read one of my stories from the album." "And how was it?" "Everyone liked it. The teacher said I have a talent for writing, and Emily, that girl over there, asked me to teach her how to write stories too. In the car, Abigail continued to talk about her day, more talkative than Richard had ever seen her. She talked about the school library, about how the teacher had promised to bring special books for her, about how Emily had shared her snack with her. "And you know what's best?" she said finally. "No one asked about before. No one wanted to. I know why I started studying only now. It was like you said, they just want to know who I am now." At home, after the bath and dinner, Abigail went up to her room to do her homework. Richard found her later, as always, writing in her album. "Dear Mommy, today was an amazing day. I went to school for the first time since you left. I was so scared, Mommy. Afraid of not being able to keep up, of the other kids laughing at me, of feeling different. But you know what? It was better than I imagined." Before Abigail could answer, Richard appeared at the door, already dressed for work. "Ready?" he asked. "I think so," Abigail replied, although her voice trembled slightly. "Then let's have breakfast. We can't be late on the first day." In the kitchen, Patricia had prepared a special breakfast. There were pancakes with syrup, fresh fruit cut into fun shapes, and hot chocolate with marshmallows, Abigail's new favorite drink. The girl ate little, but made an effort to please Patricia and Richard, who insisted on the importance of breakfast. Her eyes constantly turned to the clock on the wall, no longer Richard's Rolex, which she had finally returned, but a pretty sun-shaped clock that decorated the kitchen. In the car, on the way to school, Abigail was restless. Her fingers played nervously with the strap of her backpack as she looked out the window. "What if I can't make friends?" she asked for the third time that morning. "You will," Richard assured. "Just be yourself." "But what if they find out, you know, that you used to live on the street?" he finished gently. "Abigail, look at me." The girl turned in her seat, her big dark eyes fixed on him. "Your past is part of who you are, but it doesn't define your future. If someone finds out and is mean to you, let me know, but don't let the fear of what they might think stop you from being happy." Abigail nodded slowly, then took her album from her backpack. "I brought this to give me courage," she said. "Can I read a little before we go in?" "Of course." She opened to a specific page. Richard recognized it as one of the first she had written after moving in with him. "Dear Mommy, today I learned a new word. Fresh start. Patricia explained to me that it means starting again, having a new chance. She said it's like being born again, but being able to choose some things. I liked that word, Mommy, because that's what's happening to me, a fresh start, and this time I'm not alone." "Why did you choose that specific page?" Richard asked, curious. "Because today is another fresh start," she replied, "and I wanted to remember that I'm not alone." When they arrived at the school, the yard was full of children and parents. Abigail squeezed Richard's hand tightly as they walked to the classroom. The teacher, a young woman named Ms. Evans, greeted them with a warm smile. Richard had already spoken to her previously, explaining Abigail's situation briefly. "Welcome," she said to Abigail. "How about meeting your new classmates?" Abigail looked at Richard, clearly hesitant to let go of his hand. "It's going to be okay," he assured. "I'll pick you up after school. At the same time the clock will show, remember?" She nodded, took a deep breath, and, with a courage that surprised him, let go of his hand and followed the teacher into the classroom. Richard stood watching through the window for a few minutes. He saw Abigail sit at a desk near the window, take her album from her backpack, and place it on the table like a protective talisman. A girl with colorful braids approached, apparently, interested in the blue-covered album. Abigail seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then flashed a small smile and began talking to her classmate. It was only then that Richard was able to leave, his heart divided between worry and pride. In the afternoon, when he returned to pick up Abigail, he found her talking animatedly with the same girl with the colorful braids. Her eyes shone in a way he had never seen before. "Dad," she exclaimed upon seeing him running towards him, "you're not going to believe what happened." "Tell me," he said, taking her backpack. "The teacher asked everyone to tell a story. When it was my turn, I got scared, but then I remembered what you said about being myself. So I read one of my stories from the album." "And how was it?" "Everyone liked it. The teacher said I have a talent for writing, and Emily, that girl over there, asked me to teach her how to write stories too." In the car, Abigail continued to talk about her day, more talkative than Richard had ever seen her. She talked about the school library, about how the teacher had promised to bring special books for her, about how Emily had shared her snack with her. "And you know what's best?" she said finally. "No one asked about before. No one wanted to. Know why I started studying only now? It was like you said, they just want to know who I am now." At home, after the bath and dinner, Abigail went up to her room to do her homework. Richard found her later, as always, writing in her album. "Dear Mommy, today was an amazing day. I went to school for the first time since you left. I was so scared, Mommy, afraid of not being able to keep up, of the other kids laughing at me, of feeling different. But you know what? It was better than I imagined. The teacher is kind like you were, and I discovered that I didn't forget everything you taught me about letters and numbers. I made a friend. Her name is Emily, and she has the prettiest hair I've ever seen, full of colorful braids that look like a rainbow. When I showed her my album, her eyes sparkled. She said she also likes to write, but she had never met someone who wrote as much as me. The teacher asked us to read something to the class. I got scared at first, but then I remembered what Dad always says about being brave. I read that story I wrote about the stars, remember? The one you taught me to identify from the window of our old room. Everyone paid attention, Mommy. No one laughed, no one mocked. In the end, the teacher even asked me to write more stories to read in class. I think I've finally found my place. It's like all the pieces are fitting together. I have a dad who loves me, a warm house, food on time, and now friends and school. Is that what it's like to be truly happy? Because if it is, I think I can get used to it. With love, your Abigail P.S. Emily invited me to her birthday party on Saturday. It will be my first birthday party. Dad said we can buy a really nice gift for her. I can't wait to tell you how it was. The months turned into a year, and life in the Mendez household had found its own rhythm. Abigail flourished at school. Her grades were exemplary, and her talent for writing had caught the attention of all the teachers. Her blue album was now accompanied by others, equally filled with stories, poems, and reflections. One Saturday morning, while Patricia was preparing breakfast, Richard found an official envelope in his mail. His heart raced as he recognized the letterhead of the court. It was the final decision on Abigail's adoption. "Where is she?" he asked Patricia, holding the envelope with slightly trembling hands. "In the garden, writing as always," the housekeeper replied. "Do you want me to call her?" "No, I'll go there." He found Abigail sitting in her favorite spot under the shade of a large tree. She looked up from her notebook when she heard his footsteps approaching. "Good morning, Dad," she smiled. Her face was fuller now, healthy, and her eyes had lost that frightened look from before. "Good morning, kiddo," he replied, sitting next to her on the grass. "What are you writing today?" "A new story. Emily asked me to write something for her to read in drama class." "Can I see?" Abigail hesitated for a moment. She still had moments of insecurity about sharing her writings, but then handed him the notebook. It was a story about a girl who could talk to the stars. Each star had a different story to tell, stories of people who had left but continued to shine in the sky. It was a beautiful and subtle metaphor about loss and hope. "It's beautiful," he said, returning the notebook, "but I have something here that I think you'll want to see." He showed the official envelope to her. Abigail immediately recognized the letterhead. They had talked about the adoption process, and she understood what that envelope meant. Is that the answer?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It is. Do you want to open it with me?" Abigail nodded, putting her notebook aside. Her small hands joined Richard's as they opened the envelope. The document was full of complicated legal terms, but the conclusion was clear. The adoption had been approved. Abigail was officially, legally, and irrevocably Richard Mendez's daughter. "Does this mean," she began, her voice failing, "it means that now it's official. You are my daughter, forever." Abigail was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the document. Then, without warning, she began to cry. "What's wrong?" Richard asked, worried. "Aren't you happy?" "I am," she sobbed. "I'm so happy, but I'm also scared." "Scared of what, kiddo?" "That it's too good, that I don't deserve it, that I'll change my mind," he finished gently. She nodded, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "Abigail, look at me," he asked. "Remember what I always say about promises?" "That you always keep them," she replied. "Exactly, and this document is the biggest promise I've ever made. It means that you are my daughter not only in my heart but also in the law. No one can change that, ever." "Nay." Abigail looked again at the document, her fingers delicately tracing the letters of her new full name. Abigail Santos Mendez. Can I write about this?" she asked. "Of course," he smiled. "But first let's have breakfast. Patricia made those pancakes you love." Later, after breakfast, Richard found Abigail again in the garden. She was hunched over her blue album, writing intently. Didn't want to interrupt, but couldn't resist peeking over her shoulder. "Dear Mommy, today something incredible happened. Remember when you used to say that some things are forever? At the time, I didn't really understand what that meant. Now I do. An important paper arrived today, Mommy. A paper that says I am now officially Dad's daughter. Abigail Santos Mendez. That's my name now. Your last name and his together, like a hug made of words. I cried when I read the document, not because I was sad, but because my heart felt like it was going to explode with happiness. It's strange, isn't it? How can we cry when we're happy? Dad hugged me and said that now it's forever, that no one can change it, not even a judge. He said that family isn't just blood. It's love, choice, promise. You know what's most beautiful, Mommy? He didn't ask me to forget you. He said that I can have two types of love in my heart, the love for you, who is in heaven, and the love for him, who is here with me. Patricia made pancakes to celebrate, and afterwards Dad said, "We're going to have a small party, just the three of us, Emily and some friends from school. A family party," he said. "My first real family party. Sometimes I wonder if you can see all this from up there. If you're happy to see that I found a new dad, a new home, a new life. I wish you could meet him, Mommy. I'm sure you would get along. He taught me that family doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. Like you always said, remember? That true love is the one that stays, even when it's difficult. Now, I have a paper that says I'm his daughter forever. But you know what, Mommy? In my heart, I already was a long time ago. With love, your Abigail Santos Mendez, who now has two last names and two loves in her heart." Richard felt tears run down his face as he read. Abigail must have sensed his presence, because she turned and found him there, standing behind her. "Dad?" she called, worried. "Why are you crying?" "Because I'm happy," he replied, using the same words she had written. "Because sometimes we cry when we're too happy." Abigail smiled, a wide and genuine smile, one of those that had only started to appear after she felt truly safe. "Dad?" she called again. "Yes?" Thank you for choosing me." "No, kiddo," he replied, sitting next to her on the grass. "Thank you for choosing me too, for trusting me, for giving me the chance to be your dad." Abigail closed her album and snuggled into Richard's hug. They stayed like that for a long time, in silence, watching the clouds pass by in the blue sky of Chicago. It was a perfect moment, one of those that are kept forever in the memory. "You know," she said after a while, "I think Mom sent you to me." "Really?" "Yeah, because she knew I was going to need someone to love me after she left. And she chose very well. 5 years had passed since that day in the garden. Abigail, now 11 years old, had transformed into a bright and confident girl. Her texts no longer spoke only of pain and loneliness. They were stories full of hope, love, and overcoming. One Sunday afternoon, while organizing her room, Abigail found her first blue album, the one Richard had bought as soon as she arrived. The pages were a little yellowed by time, but the words were still there, silent witnesses of her journey. "Dad!" she called, coming down the stairs with the album in her hands. "Look what I found." Richard was in his office, now transformed into a more welcoming space, with an extra armchair where Abigail used to sit to read or do homework while he worked. "Your first album," he smiled, immediately recognizing the blue cover. "It's been a while since I saw it. I was reading some things I wrote," she said, sitting in her usual armchair. "It's weird to read it now. It feels like it was in another life." "It was, in a way," Richard replied. "You've changed a lot since then." "You've changed too," she observed. "You don't have that sadness in your eyes anymore." Richard smiled, admiring how his daughter continued to be insightful as always. "You know," she continued, flipping through the album, "I found something interesting here. Do you want to see?" It was one of the last entries in the first album, written shortly after the adoption was official. "Dear Mommy, today I realized something important. Remember when you used to say that sometimes we need to lose something to gain something else? At the time, I didn't understand. I thought it was unfair. Why have to lose to gain? But now I understand, Mommy. Losing you was the hardest thing I've ever been through. Then came the street, the hunger, the fear. I thought I would never be happy again. But then I found Dad, or rather, he found me. And little by little I was gaining things that I never imagined I would have. A home, a family, friends, school. I even gained a new last name. But you know what's most important? I gained the chance to be happy again. Different, but happy. Dad taught me that we don't need to forget the past to build a future, that we can keep the good memories and learn from the bad ones. Today, looking back, I see that every difficult moment brought me here. Every night on the street, every day, of hunger, every tear, all of that is part of who I am. And you know what? I wouldn't change anything, because if something were different, maybe I would have never met Dad. Never would have Patricia making pancakes in the morning, never would. Have Emily as my best friend, never would have discovered that I can be strong, even when I'm scared. Sometimes, when I'm writing in my room, I look out the window and see a star shining brighter than the others. I like to think it's you, Mommy, watching over me. I wish you could see how I am now. My hair is no longer tangled. My clothes are clean and warm, and most importantly, my heart is full of love again. Dad says you would be proud. I think you already are, because you always said that true love finds a way. And it did, didn't it? Through him, with eternal love. Your Abigail. Richard felt his heart clench as he read those words. Even after so much time, Abigail's wisdom and sensitivity still surprised him. "After I wrote this," she said, "I started having fewer nightmares. It was as if I had finally understood that it was okay to be happy again." "And it is," he confirmed. "Your mother would want that." Abigail closed the album carefully and looked at Richard with a serious expression. "Dad, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." Remember that day on the sidewalk, when you found me? How could I forget? I had decided that it would be my last day, she confessed, her voice low. I was so tired, so alone, I thought it would be better to give up. Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he thought about what could have happened if he had passed by that day, as he always did. But then you stopped, she continued. You were the first person in a long time who really saw me. Even when you got angry and kicked my papers, you were still seeing me. And then you came back. No one had ever come back before. She paused, her eyes shining with contained tears. You know what's most amazing? That day changed 2 lives. Mine, because I gained a dad. And yours, because you gained a daughter. It's like destiny knew we needed each other. Richard couldn't hold back his own tears. You're right, he said. I was also lost back then. I just didn't know it. I lived. For work, for money, I had forgotten what it was like to feel, what it was like to love. And now? Now I have you. And that changed everything. At that moment, Patricia entered the office carrying a tray with hot chocolate and cookies. Still, Abigail's favorite combination. I was passing by and heard voices, she smiled. I thought you might want a snack. Patricia, Abigail called as the housekeeper placed the tray on the table. You're also part of this story, you know? How so, dear? You helped me trust again. You taught me that family isn't just who has the same blood, it's who chooses to stay, who chooses to love. Patricia, always so composed, couldn't contain her emotion. She hugged Abigail tightly, then recomposed herself and quickly left the office, although they could still hear her sobs in the hallway. Dad? Abigail called after a moment. Yes? Can I write one last letter in this album to close this story? Of course you can. Abigail picked up a pen and opened the album to the last blank page. Her handwriting, now firm and elegant, flowed over the paper. Dear Mommy, this is my last letter in this album. Not because I'm going to stop writing, you know I'll never stop, but because this story needs an ending. 5 years ago, I was a lost girl, hungry and cold, writing on the sidewalk because I had no more hope. Today, I am Abigail Santos Mendez. I've a family, a home, and more love in my heart than I ever imagined possible. Dad taught me that sometimes endings are just new beginnings in disguise, that we can build happiness even after the deepest sadness, that love, when it's true, only grows, it never replaces. So it's not really goodbye, Mommy. It's just the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I'm going to keep writing, telling stories, spreading hope, because now I know that it's possible. It's always possible to start again. Thank you for having taught me to write. Thank you for having taught me to love. And thank you for having sent an angel disguised as an angry businessman to save me that day. With eternal love, your Abigail, who is now happy again. P.S. Dad is reading over my shoulder and crying as always. I think he also wants to thank you for having entrusted him with your greatest treasure. And you know what? He took very good care of him. Richard hugged his daughter, feeling his heart overflow with love and gratitude. Outside the office window, a particularly bright star twinkled in the twilight sky. Abigail smiled, knowing that somehow her mother was there blessing that perfect moment.